All right, so I'd like to start just by welcoming everyone to the Grand Way. The Grand Way has been extremely generous in allowing us to use their space without any charges because this is an agricultural event. So we're very, very grateful to them for that, and also to Elanco for sponsoring this evening. My name is Emma Borkowski. For those of you who don't know me, I'm an assistant professor at the Ontario Veterinary College, and I'm really just a stand-in. The person who is really critical in organizing this, Dr. Andrew Peregrine, is not able to be here this evening, so he's asked me to just sort of stand in, welcome you. Thank you for joining us. We hope that you'll be able to learn some useful information this evening and hear from our great speakers. But I'm not going to go on for too long. I'm going to introduce to you Dr. Neil Sargison, who is in farm animal production at the University of Edinburgh. And he's going to tell you a little bit more about sort of the plan for the evening and what the context is.
Thanks, Emma. So I don't know, can you hear at the back? The sound didn't seem to be great, but yeah. So as Emma's just said, I'm Neil Sargison. It's fantastic to be back here in Canada and to see old friends and things. So there's Vince, there's Kathy, there's Christoph at the back who's about to sneak out, but and new friends that we've made. We've been here as part of a collaborative arrangement that we have between Canada and New Zealand and the UK, in which our focus is all about sustainable worm control. And the need for that focus surrounds both the fact that anthelmintic resistance has around the world become a major constraint to our ability to control these parasites, and also that some of the parasites that we're dealing with are changing in the way that they behave. And the real example of that is the way that Haemonchus is now behaving in the way it affects sheep and goat flocks and herds here in Canada. So we've been visiting Canada, and along with me have been my colleagues from New Zealand and from Grenada, and also from across different parts of Canada. And we've been meeting with people from Quebec, from Ontario, and from Calgary in Alberta. So and we've met with people from all aspects of the small ruminant industry in terms of what we've been doing. And we've also we were really fortunate on Monday to go on a couple of farm visits. Mike is here, and thank you so much for that visit and for letting us see your system. It was just absolutely fantastic. And then we've visited Bill and Delma McCutcheon as well. And we've got to see what the challenges are, and we've got to have get some sort of insight as to what the reasons for those challenges are, and to start to think about solutions. So I'm not the one who's going to be talking this evening. I'm going to introduce my colleagues to talk to you this evening. I believe that first up is Andy. Is that right? Have I got the order right? So I'm first going to introduce Andy Greer. Andy Greer is an animal scientist colleague of mine. Andy and I have worked together for many years, and Andy's going to give you his perspective on the topic. He can introduce that for himself. The three colleagues that are going to be speaking this evening have asked that rather than this just be a nice talk that they give, that we can make this as interactive as possible. So if Andy says anything that winds you up, or if Andy says anything that that you know really
they can't understand,
but purely because you don't understand the accent. But if Andy comes up with anything like that, please interject, because we want this meeting to be more about what interests you and your needs than what interests us and our needs. So yeah, Andy, over to you.
a little red box. Not on that screen. There is down there, but not.
Should be on this one here. Just checking this recording.
Yeah, it's recording. Okay, yeah, it looks like she's screen. just trying to make sure that we're actually recording.
It's like confusing, you don't you? Okay, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming along. As Neil said, I'm from New Zealand, and in particular, I'm from Lincoln University, which is about here in the South Island. So it's been a reasonable distance to come, but it's been worth it. It's been a really good few days. And so, as Neil said, in terms of what we're ideally planning is to keep it reasonably informal. Well, I've got a heap of slides there which we can go through, and I can give you a boring talk if you want. But if there are things that you guys actually would rather, more sort of poignant ones which you would rather hear about, then I'm more than happy to field some questions and flick back and forth between the throughout the presentation. So really, I mean, this isn't about me delivering stuff to you guys. It's actually, you know, if there's specific questions that you may have that I might be able to help with, then go for it. Excuse me. It's not COVID, honest. So what I did have planned in the absence of any questions or interjections is a little bit of a brief sort of background of New Zealand sheep production systems, slightly different to here, and then sort of into where our sort of situation is with regards to New Zealand. Oh, thanks, John. And then some of the aspects that are more aligned with my areas of research, so nutrition in particular, with regards to trying to provide resilience to infection, and also some targeted selective treatments as a way of helping to sort of provide some refuge here and slow development of resistance. So no burning questions, interjections as yet? No? That button doesn't work. All right. So in terms of the New Zealand sheep production system, so where we are in New Zealand at the moment is quite different to where we were 40 years ago. So 40 years ago, we had about 70 odd million sheep. And since then, there's a number of changes which have happened. So we used to have in the mid 80s, we used to have a subsidy, we used to have a headage payment, and also wool used to be the main source of income. Then basically the government got rid of the subsidy, the wool price tanked and has stayed low pretty much since. Some people still think it's going to come back, but so that's forced us to change our focus from being mainly on wool production through to land production, and that changes our stocking rates as well, because you know, with wool, if you feed an animal at maintenance, it's still going to grow wool. But if you want to grow lamb or meat, if you feed them at maintenance, they're not going to grow. So it changes your stocking rate. So that's had overdone.
Not behaving itself with the screen share. That's all. There we go. We should be okay now.
And as well as that, there's been a lot of land use change as well. So a lot of increase in dairy sector, a lot of land's gone to marginal land's gone to forestry as well. And so our sheep numbers have declined quite considerably. So our industry, if you like, has contracted, and that's caused a few issues from a processing perspective. So there's a lot of capital infrastructure put into freezing works, into meat processing plants. A lot of them are closed over the times, and it has caused a few major disruptions. But to give you an idea in terms of where we're at the moment compared with where we were in 1990, as in the table in the bottom there, you know, our lambing percentage has increased, and I know those of you on a 3 and 2 system, you'll look at that and go, oh, it's nothing to crow about. But even at 100 just on 130%, our carcass weights have increased from where we used to sell around about 13 kilos to 19 kilos. So the end result is that even though we're gone from 70 million sheep to about 23 million sheep now, we're still producing the same amount of lamb as what we were when we had 70 million sheep. So our system has actually become more efficient from that perspective. And in fact, actually, if we really want to sing pro about it, you know, we've in terms of the sheep industry, have met their requirements as far as the Kyoto Protocol. Who cares about the Paris Accord? We can go all the way back to Kyoto in terms of our reductions in emissions. So it's a changing landscape, if you like. It's not. And our breeds have changed as well, right? You think I'd know my way around a computer by now, wouldn't you? And our breeds have changed as well. So, you know, if we go back in terms of the good old days of 1979, right, and even through the early 80s, predominantly a Romney breed, so crossbred wool. As that focus has changed to meat production, Romney itself has far less, and a lot greater increase of what we call composites or crossbreeds. And these are mainly made up of, obviously they have a Romney base. There's a lot more use of Texel, and Finn and East Frisian have come in as well. There's still very much a British breed based flock that we have, and that just naturally follows with the change in focus with regards to our markets. New Zealand itself is a small country, but it's actually reasonably varied in its climate. We go from measuring rainfall in meters on the west coast, and here we're going up to about 10 meters. Places like St Murchison will get rainfall about 13 meters of rain a year, through to less than about half a meter of rain a year on the east coast. So within a short distance, very varied climates, and as a result, obviously in terms of soil moisture and the droughts and that, or the dryness that we expect to get on the east coast, most seasons will have what we call a summer dry on the east coast of both islands, and occasionally get dry up in the very north as well. So we go from being very sort of subtropical in the north to very temperate in the south, and that has a number of implications, not only in terms of disease prevalence, and obviously in this kind of workshop we're dealing with differences in terms of parasite challenges and the species of parasite challenges, but also other disease challenges. Facial eczema, for example, is a big problem for animals in the North Island, particularly in the upper north and around Wanganui. In the South Island, not so much of an issue. It also changes our nutrition and our ability to feed the animals. So we're mainly C4 plants, kikuyu grass, etc., up in the north of the north, and temperate C3 ryegrass and clovers down in the South Island. So that changes how well we can feed our animals at certain times of the year as well. So even though we're a small country, quite a bit of variation. There are some exceptions, but generally speaking, we're dealing with ryegrass white clover pastures. These are reasonably extensive operations where animals are outdoors pretty much all year round. So lambing time, even at lambing time, animals will lamb outside. The only time that they come in will be for shearing, and that'll be for 12 hours to empty out before they get shorn, and then they're back out onto pasture. So relatively low input. In terms of the use of supplementary feed, minimal use of supplementary feed. We may use conserved forages that will grow over the summer period, plant in the spring, and in terms of a forage crop or a fodder crop, which will then feed out in situ in the winter period. So we won't cut and carry. Everything will be break fed out in the paddock. We do have an increasing use of specialist finishing forages, so mainly lucerne or alfalfa, as you may be more familiar with it, and also increasing use of herb clover mixes. And they're typically specifically there for lamb finishing to get the nutrition up to the lambs. There are challenges with some of those herb clover mixes in terms of persistency. So they might only last for 3 or 4 seasons before they wear out, and then they get replanted. So they're not cheap. And certainly not as cheap as some of our more permanent ryegrass stands. As I mentioned, in terms of our lambing, pretty much out on pasture, very little shepherding. Essentially, we just leave them to it. And if they live, they live. If they don't, if we find the carcass, we'll pick it up eventually. So pretty strong natural selection, and that obviously over time that actually does pay for itself. And particularly for things like cold tolerance, for mothering ability, there's a lot of strong natural selection pressures that exist there. Some of our countries reasonably flat, others you can see in the background there, some sort of reasonably easy hill, and then we can get into a lot of sort of rougher stuff as well. And a lot of that rougher stuff it may have been cleared bush, but it's an oversown with pastures, but not necessarily worked up because it's just simply too steep to put a tractor on it. So there is quite a bit of variation in our topography as well. I'll very quickly skip through this in terms of our overall seasonal management. So in the winter time, quite different to what you expect or see around the winter time around here. We can actually still see the ground, and we can actually still see the grass. But we'll have very intensive stocking. We'll split paddocks up into multiple parts using temporary fences, and mob stock them where they will graze the pastures quite hard. I'll do this in addition to grazing forage crops or fodder crops that we've put in. And those fodder crops could be kale, could be swedes, could be fodder beet, anything like that. Then as we get down to the spring, we basically we spread out, and so our pasture production starts to increase. Doesn't increase as steeply as what it seems to here. And so if we spread everything out across our paddocks, we can actually still keep on top of our pasture growth and keep it in a vegetative state and keep that nutrition in there. And so essentially that's the reason why we spread out animals across all of our paddocks, is to keep that grazing pressure on. Because I mean, ryegrass is like a teenager, right? All it wants to do is reproduce, and so it very quickly puts up a seed head if you don't keep on top of it. And then throughout the summer, rotational grazing, and again, and some of our challenges we have there are still maintaining feed quality. The pastures want to reproduce, they want to go to seed, and so our grazing management there actually has to be on point to make sure we can keep our nutrition up to our young stock as we want to finish our lambs. And this is where some of those specialist forages, the chicory, plantain, and the herb clover mixes start to come into their own, because they'll maintain their quality as they go through. And then simply in the autumn, just a clean up graze as we go around, try to save something along for winter. In terms of where we are with regards to anthelmintics. So this is a terrible table. Don't worry, you don't have to worry about the figures. All right, this is just as an example. So it gives you a little bit of an example in terms of the drug combinations that we have available to us. And it's a little bit misleading because it says here the BZs, the Vamazole, ivermectin, ivermectin. It's very hard for us to actually get a single active on its own. Right, most of our drugs are all in combinations, and we have pretty much all the combinations that currently are available. So we've got a Draquantil, ivermectin, our StarTech, the Zolvix Plus. We can no longer get Montepantal on its own, and obviously the triple. Now, the key thing here is, and obviously you're interested in potentially getting Zolvix. Is it Zolvix or Zolvix Plus you're wanting to get? Just straight Zolvix? Right, so the key thing here is that even though we've got triple, we've got all these different combinations, we've still got issues with resistance, right? We've still got issues with drug failure. What happened in New Zealand is that back in the early 2000s, we were starting to get some traction with regards to anthelmintic resistance and some of the issues with anthelmintic resistance. Then within a relatively short space of time, of course, there was 2 new actives come out, but it was not only that, there was all these combinations started coming out around about then as well. What we didn't do is we didn't change a damn thing. And so 10, 15 years later, we're still in the situation where we're back with basically where we were in the early 2000s with regards to drug failure. Right? And that's one of the key things. It's not, I'm not saying don't have new anthelmintics and don't go for it, right? But if we don't change the way in which we use those anthelmintics, then we're going to end up in the exact same situation. And if you've got Zolvix coming out, right, you've got to use it in a different way. We can't just rely on the way we've been using them, right? Otherwise, we're just delaying the problem. And in 10 years' time, you're still going to have an issue with resistance. Yes, sir.
Has there been any kind of research or studying of, okay, you have ivermectin resistance in your sheep, or the parasites in the sheep, you stop using it completely? Is there, in 15 years, can you come back and it might be effective again? Or
Okay, there are other people here that are far more qualified to answer that myself. My answer to you would be that that no. But other people. Sorry for the recording. The question is, if you've got ivermectin resistance, if you stop using ivermectin for a period of time, will you get it back to a situation of susceptibility? My short answer to that is no. There's been a lot of discussion around fitness of resistance and whether in time the parasite population would drift back to being susceptible. There are others here who are far more in a better position to answer that than myself, but my answer would be no. But Neil.
So I'm just going to shout for the recording. Generally speaking, what happens is if you've not used it for a while, the first time you use it, it'll be great and it will seem to be doing its job. But it doesn't take much more than a couple of uses before you end up back to where you started before, because the parasites that have got the genes that are conferring the resistance are still there. And the minute you start using it again, you just select for that, for that resistance. So there's no real evidence of sustained efficacy after not using the drug. And that's why the old-fashioned advice that we used to give about rotating anthelmintic drug groups didn't actually work, because it only prevented the resistance getting worse to the one group for the time in which, for the years in which you were using something else, but you still kept coming back to the same point that you left off at.
So just for the recording, Neil said he agrees.
Yeah.
Although it may work once or twice, but then after that you're back to say. I mean, the reality is that it doesn't matter what drug you are, and it doesn't matter whether you use it in the most responsible way possible. Anytime you use a drug, and it doesn't matter whether it's an antibiotic or an anthelmintic, anytime you use a drug, you're putting selection pressure on for resistance, right? And so you know, even if you are providing a lot of refugia and that's a lot of work, that just slows things down. You're still, anytime you pull out and use a drug, you're going to be selecting for resistance, and that's the nature of it. Sometimes it might be an infinitesimal small amount that you're going to be selecting for, right? But effectively, you're still heading down that path. So I'm not saying don't use drugs and don't bring on your drugs, but you've got to be aware of that there are, well, you know that there are implications of using them. So what I was supposed to be talking to you about was something that refers to as the unwormy trinity. So in particular, this section here on nutrition and a little bit on targeted selective treatments. So nutrition, really, I mean, I'm a nutritionist at heart. I'm more of an animal productionist, and yeah, there is that saying that if your animals are well fed, if you've got nutrition right, then the majority of animal health issues disappear. Now, they may not disappear, you just can't quite see them, or they're not as obvious, maybe in some cases. So really, the way I look at it is nutrition is your trump card. So then you can save your joker being your anthelmintics. And the other one I'm going to talk about really is, or hopefully if I have time still, is the targeted selective treatments. You know, in terms of making sure we do look after whatever drugs we've got and slow down resistance, then providing refugia is a reasonably important way of doing that. Excuse me. So nutrition for a start. So looking at the periparturient ewe, we know that relaxation and immunity is nutritionally driven. There's been stuff from John Donaldson for a start back in the late 90s. Jos Houdak then followed that up with quite a number of trials after that, and showed that quite nicely that breakdown in immunity is largely due to protein nutrition. So John Donaldson's work, putting it all together and looking at in relation to the amount of metabolizable protein that's needed, we can, and this is a log scale here, so we're talking about thousands versus tens of thousands of worms within the animal. So in other words, to keep a reasonable immunity, you need to supply somewhere around about 300 grams of metabolizable protein per day. Now that's a truckload of protein for a ewe to be consuming. So on our pastures, and if your pastures here are predominantly orchard grass or something like that, there'll be reasonably similar. Our pastures supply on average about 80 grams of metabolizable protein per kilogram of dry matter. So a ewe, you can only realistically expect to have somewhere about 180, maybe 200 grams of metabolizable protein from pasture alone. So we're a long way off that 300 of where she needs to be able to maintain her immunity, right? Obviously, if you're indoors or if you're supplementary feeding, even then there's a lot of high quality proteins needed to get them up to that point. There's a lot of soybean meal that's got to go into the mix to make that work. So it's expensive. It can technically be done, but it's expensive to do, but it's quite difficult to achieve. In terms of the lambs, and I've adjusted some of these slides from the other day. In terms of the lambs, what is important for the lambs here is they have enough protein again to actually develop their immunity. So Mike Bound showed back in the 90s that again protein rather than energy was required for the animal to develop an immune response. So a lamb needs about 50 grams of metabolizable protein per day. That's what it costs them to develop their immunity. They're only going to do that once they have additional protein to do it. And so if we look at the lines here are the blues and the protein and the red's energy. So the dashed ones are the requirements and the solid ones are their supply. If we look at the supply of both energy and protein relative to their requirements, they only start getting into excess in about sort of the mid-30s. Maybe once we get down to about mid-40s, they're getting somewhere close to having 50 grams of metabolizable protein available, right? And that's about the weight and usually coincides with about the age of the animals where we expect them to be developing an immune response. You know, they're typically out to around about that sort of 6 to 8 months of age by the time we get into those weights. So ideally, where we need to aim for in terms of lamb nutrition is to actually provide them with a lot more protein right from the outset, to arm them with what they need so they can actually develop their immunity. Right? If we give them the nutritional resources, they'll either show either resilience or they'll develop it through into resistance and minimize the effects of infection of parasites. But the hard bit is how do you actually give them that level of nutrition? There are some options, say, for example, in terms of bioactive forages. Now, these can be a little bit hit and miss in terms of their anti-parasitic effects. The two images on the left, yep, those on the left. Just had to check which way I was looking, you're looking. The two images on the left here are from the evidence of physical damage against worms when animals have been consuming Serratia lespedeza. Is that how you say it? I can never say it right. And so that is one plant, one crop that has consistently shown anti-parasitic effects, and it seems to have the right, not just the right level of condensed tannins, but the right type of condensed tannins to actually have a direct anti-parasitic effect. The others, it can vary a little bit depending on the times and depending on what sort of tannins are there. So plantain has reasonably low levels of condensed tannins. Chicory, again, has very low levels of condensed tannins, but it does have, if it has any, but it does have secretary lactanes, which are another secondary compound which has been shown to have an effect, particularly in lungworm and deer. A little bit more hit and miss in terms of the direct anthelmintic effects of chicory and livestock. Some of that may be due to the cultivar of chicory and variation within that. Some of it may be the conditions that it's grown under. I mean, these plants produce these secondary compounds because they're under stress. You know, it helps protect the plant from insect attack. And so when they are under stress, they'll have higher levels of these secondary, often have higher levels of these secondary compounds in them. So it does, that's what I mean by they're a little bit hit and miss in terms of whether they're there in sufficient quantity to have an effect. What they do consistently do, though, is provide a high quality nutrient source. Right. So most studies that have looked at these two forages in particular, compared with ryegrass and white clover, intakes have been increased by about 30%. Right. Once you start to do that, then you're getting back up to the level of nutrition that you need that's getting close to this blue line. So you're starting to then arm the animal with a lot more nutritional resources, a lot more energy, a lot more protein, because if your digestibility's higher digestible, higher flow rates through the rumen, greater intakes, greater total amount of nutrition going in. Yes. Sorry, I'm repeating the question. So the question was that whether protein is more important than energy, and the short answer is yes. So both when the supplementation studies are done with both the periparturient ewe and also the growing lamb, when they've supplemented with metabolizable protein and or metabolizable energy, energy itself has very little effect. It's the protein which is actually really important, right? And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense from a lamb immune development perspective. A lot of the cells are immunological cells, are very proteinaceous in nature. The antibodies are full of protein. All the leukotrienes, they're all full of protein, full of cysteine. There's a math. When you mount an immune response, yourself, if you graze yourself or cut yourself and it gets infected, right? The body can react quite powerfully, and there's a mass of cells which in cell proliferation which goes on. All of that requires a resource, and so protein is definitely more important. Excuse me. So we've also had, I mean, one of the other advantages some of these forages can have, and I'm not trying to peddle seed for some of these forages, but. And this is some discussion we've had over the last few days is around due to their physical structure and their anatomical structure. So they are much more erect in nature, and that doesn't provide the right or as ideal conditions for the larvae to survive. So you think about a ryegrass or even an orchard grass or a pasture, it's in the base of the sward, it's dark and it's damp and it's sort of the perfect conditions for a larvae to survive. Now, they get killed by UV just like most other organisms. They need moisture just like most other organisms. And so where you have something that is more erect in nature, then it can dry out a lot easier. I tried to get a photo because I was doing this from a hospital, not hospital, hotel room. It's been a long day. And I was trying to get the pictures because there's also some other structures on these plants where they have sort of hairs on the stem. Which I don't know if you can see, but if you ever Google hairy stems, don't. Images of hairy stems, not a good thing to. But anyway, and there is also some belief that those hairs can also help stop or make it harder for the larvae to get up. Now, how strong that evidence is, I don't really know, but that's at least some of the reports that we hear. Perhaps surprisingly, it seems like not a lot of people have actually looked at the transmission and the importance of forage type and larval transmission. And so one that I could find was back from the early 90s of Ray Moss and Alex Vlasov, that where they seeded different types of pastures with larvae. So relative to a ryegrass white clover sward. So these are all relative. Relative to ryegrass white clover sward, they had a greater recovery of larvae from prairie grass and white clover. Much lower recovery of larvae from both chicory and also lucerne. And so again, it's most likely some of that erect nature of the plant, just making it harder for the larvae to get up, because it's all very well the larvae being down here on either soil surface or on the pseudostem, but that's not where the transmission occurs, right? An animal that's grazing is grazing up here, and so that's where they need to get to. So anything we can do to help stop them from getting up there is going to help reduce larval transmission. The last thing I'm talking about with regards to nutrition is with regards to fecal egg counts. And this is one of my favourite hobby horses in terms of how nutrition can trick us and some of the considerations. I mean, we use fecal egg counts because it's pretty much the only measure we've got. right? There's not a lot of other measurements that we have with regards to determining what the parasite status of an animal is. But we also need to be a little bit careful about how we interpret the fecal egg count sometimes, right? We tend to focus on the numerator to completely forget about the denominator. Fecal egg counts are a ratio of eggs per gram of feces. Now this is, when you think about it, it's pretty sort of straightforward stuff, but no one ever does think about it. We always just focus on that top value. So anything that's going to influence the volume of feces is going to influence our fecal egg count. It's going to influence our concentration of eggs in the feces. Level of feed intake. A well-fed animal versus a poorly fed animal is going to have a different concentration of eggs in the feces. Things, feed quality in terms of digestibility, how much disappears, and also fecal dry matter. So I've got the example here of 2 lambs. This is a sort of standard values for, say, a 25 kilogram lamb, growing at either 100 grams per day or 330 grams per day. Now, the one growing at 330 needs to eat twice as much as the one growing at 100, right? So maintenance is a fixed cost, and then our production levels on top of that. All other things being equal, then, we can have half the fecal egg count in the one growing at 330 grams per day, and it's still producing the same number of total eggs per day. It's still excreting 1 million eggs per day. It's got an egg count of 400 eggs per gram. Our one growing poorly, it's got an egg count of 860 eggs per gram. And that gets magnified even further if we think about fecal dry matter and sort of hard pellety feces. So all too often, we look at a lamb and we'll look at an animal and we see a high egg count, we see a low growth rate, and think, oh, you're a high shedder or you're a wormy animal and providing a lot of contamination onto the pasture. Compared to their contemporaries, they may not actually be all that bad. As I said, it's a really simple concept, but actually considering their level of feed intake and considering what their current levels of performance are can sometimes make a difference in how you interpret that fecal egg count. How are we going for time? You want to keep going? Oh, I can talk for hours. I'm not sure my voice will put up for talking for hours. Okay, so the next part, just you guys just tell me when you've had enough, right? Don't worry about being polite. The next part really is around targeted selective treatments, and the principle here is that we know the parasite populations are over dispersed. We know that they're not evenly distributed throughout the population. We talk about the 80-20 or the 70-30 rule. Yet we still have this thing where we like treating all of the animals at once, right? And it sort of defies, it actually defies pretty much everything that we know about how a parasite population is distributed within a population, within a host population. So there's different ways in which we can think about how we're going to target our treatments and just target our drenching towards some animals that may need it most. So an example here in terms of the relationship between body condition score and fecal egg count, and a whole lots of different groups have used down here, but the moral of the story is that poor condition ewes are going to have likely to have higher egg counts. Not on here, but we heard yesterday, I think it was, that for Marcha scores are also likely to be correlated with body condition as well. So targeting it to the low body condition ewes, the ones which are either not showing resilience, because there could be low body condition because they've got parasitism, or whether it's a driver or whether it's a consequence of having parasitism is sometimes hard to tell. But targeting our drenching towards those animals which are more likely to benefit from it and need it. Because it's not necessarily always easy to tell which animals are likely to need it. Now, most of you will be familiar with Marcha. Yep. Just pointing out that it's actually gone onto an app now. So you can take a picture on your phone and it will tell you whether to drench. I don't actually think it would be faster than not taking a picture on your phone and doing it by eye, but it's pretty fancy. The other sort of fancy things they can have that we're playing with at the moment is things around animal behaviour. And this is with basically the accelerometers, and we're starting to look at how animal behaviour changes in relation to disease status, and one of those disease status is of course parasitism. So we do have different profiles of patterns of, in this case, eating of animals throughout the day. And so this is animals pre-drenching versus post-drenching. And if you sort of squint your eyes and tilt your head to the left, you can kind of see that there is less variation, or the greater variation before drenching than there is after drenching. And that's kind of to be expected as well, because not all animals respond or react or are affected by parasites at the same time and in the same way. And so if we start to see greater variation in the population, that starts to tell us, okay, maybe we should go out and take a look, because there's some individuals in there at least which may be suffering from infection. So at least as a pointer, or as a sort of a canary, if you like, with regards to something going on, it could be a valuable tool. Potentially, we could look at individual profiles and pick out individual animals, but these tags aren't cheap, and certainly for sheep, they're pretty much impractical for sheep. The ones we have been using in sheep, again, are very expensive, and on an individual animal basis, you just wouldn't go there. The other aspect is around using live weight gain or performance-based TSTs. Yes. By C, are you meaning if you, sorry, the question was, the question was, if in terms of the variability in the data, is that something that we can see, or do we need the data to be able to look at? So by that, do you mean if we are, is there an alert, or sort of real-time alert, do you mean? Yes, yep. So the follow-up part to that was that, can you actually notice it if you were to be looking at the animal? Yep, absolutely. If you've got the time to sit there and look at your animals all day, every one of them, go for it. You can save yourself a bundle on sensors. And that's around, I mean, these things can be done remotely. And one of the challenges that we have, say, from a New Zealand perspective, is that, quite often our animals are out the back. They're on the hills out the back. We're not anywhere near them. It could be a week before we see them. Sometimes it can be a couple of months if they're in the extensive high country before they get seen. So from a welfare perspective, we're not looking after the animals. They could have done anything. And so having, I mean, generally there's a bit of natural selection goes on in there as well, right? But generally, so having something like these sensors on there does actually provide a way in which we can at least say to the markets that, look, we're doing something positive with regards to animal welfare, and we can pick up when something's going wrong. So the other thing is around targeted treatments and targeted drenching is using performance-based or live weight gain-based criteria. And this is really sort of where my stuff around TSDs has been. The moral of the story here really is that for sheep, generally speaking, if we go out and actually assess them quite regularly, assess them every 2 weeks, then you can reduce your drenchers by about 50% with very small impacts on productivity, to the point of a very, minimal, almost immeasurable reductions in live weight gain. In this case here, we stretched it out to a month. We still reduced our drench use by half, but our reduction in live weight gain is about 15%. And that kind of makes sense when you think about it, because if you've got an animal that's just on its downhill slide, and if you miss it after week 2, or after 2 weeks, it's only on the downhill slide for another 2 weeks before you pick it up. You've got a month between treatments and it's just on the downhill slide. It may not get treated on the first one. It's got a whole month to lose production before you pick it up. So there's a trade-off there between how much effort you want to put in versus what sort of level of production loss is acceptable. Because it does take time. I mean, the average flock size in New Zealand is 2,500. That's ewes. So most people have got about 4,000 lambs it takes time to weigh 4,000 lambs, a lot of time. And so it depends how much effort you want to put in here. There's a trade-off between that, your inputs, and what level of production loss is acceptable. And for us, at least, it's likely that that level of production loss isn't going to be acceptable in the young female stock if we're wanting to make them as hoggets. What do you guys call hoggets? Yearlings.
Hoggets.
Hoggets, you do call them hoggets? Yep, excellent. So if you wanted to make your ewe lambs as hoggets, right, then that's probably not acceptable because you need to get them to target weight. If you're not wanting to make them as hoggets, then it might be that you've got plenty of time to grow these out and before they lamb as a two-tooth, what we call a two-tooth, presume you must call them that too. That there's plenty of time to catch up on any production loss. So you may not be, that might not be acceptable for your lambs you're wanting to send away to the work. So you drench them like buggery, so they get off the place, and you use your female ones as your source of refusion. So it's not, I guess what I'm trying to get at there is that it's not a all or nothing game. You know, you can mix and match it and use different classes of livestock to provide refusion, providing they're actually going to be grazing the same areas. You don't have to go all in or nothing, but there can be sort of bits and pieces. You choose the bits and pieces that suit you best. The last bit is also then, well, that's all well and good and that's fine. What else can you get out of it? Right. And so you could go down to the marketing track and say, look, there's, we're being responsible in the way we use our chemicals. We're not organic, but we're not splashing drinks around for the sake of it. But also what you can do is you can start to select animals based on the number of treatments. Now, this isn't necessarily specifically resistance and is not necessarily solely resilience. Well, it is resilience. They may or may not be resistant. So you're not actually worried about what their egg counts are. So we looked at this from the perspective of, does that actually impact on your genetic selection? So this is in a fully recorded flock in the Kikwa stud at Lincoln, because the last thing we wanted to do was say, yeah, go and select all your ones that only needed 1 or 2 treatments and then find out that they're actually your poorest performing animals. So quite happily, I'll report to you that there doesn't really appear to be any negative trade-off with having or selecting the animals that only needed 1 or 2 treatments. And in particular, with regards to reproduction, so most of our indexes, our genetic indexes for growth, adult size, meat yield, wool, no effect relative to the number of treatments. Positive benefits particularly in terms of reproduction, and a positive one in terms of survival. And an overall index, there's a positive association as well. Now, the reproduction one we can kind of explain, because based on the live weight gain thing, then a larger animal's going to have needed fewer treatments, positive associations between body size, population rate, reproductive success, et cetera, but it is important to know that if you do go down that track, that you can make progress in terms of reducing your reliance on drenches, and you're not compromising your potential in terms of your genetic potential for other production traits. And I think that's something that's really useful to have. Whether they're resistant, whether they're resilient, couldn't tell you. That's pretty much me. But I'll leave you with this, that what we do need to do is make sure if we're using a new drug, if we're using a new chemical, that we do actually treat it differently, that we do, if we go back to using it the same way that we've used all our other drugs, we're just going to end up in the same situation in 10 years' time. Learn the lessons from us, but that's what we've screwed up.
Say, okay, you feed the worm into you, whatever the worm takes away, you can make up this nutrition, which might not be quite as easy when you have something that sucks blood, right?
Yeah, I mean, so the losses from Haemonchus are quite considerable, and so your nutrition will still help provide some resilience. What nutrition does is allow you to, particularly in the adult animal, to maintain their immunity, and that period. In the young lambs, it'll allow them to help replace their losses. It may not be able to fully make up for all of those losses that they've got. And Homoncus is a bit of a different beast compared with the other temperate ones. But nutrition will certainly help. It'll help provide some resilience. And if you talk to Neil, will tell you that, there's in Malawi, correct me if I'm wrong, Neil, but when he's been doing studies in Malawi, that they don't even use the Fibonacci chart because the animals are because of the level of nutrition, they're so anemic right from the outset. So they've got no room to move. They've got no resources themselves. So nutrition may not be the answer, the complete answer, but it's certainly going to help. Right? It provides them with a much bigger buffer zone before you start getting into problems. So the question was whether nutrition was any useful for Homoncus. Is that pretty much?
Andy, I'm going to ask you a question, but I'm not going to repeat it. I'm just going to speak it into the microphone.
Good.
We've learnt this week about situation that happens here in Canada where dry ewes turned out in the springtime die of Homoncus within 2 or 3 weeks of actually being turned out onto pastures. And we believe that some of the story is because they've been housed for a long time and their immunity has waned. And we also believe that some of the story is because in the spring conditions here, when the temperatures are increasing so quickly, that the Homoncus just gets established so very, very quickly. So you've told us about nutrition and you've told us about various forage crops that can be grown, and we've considered other approaches to worm control. Without putting you on the spot, how do you think that these things that you just talked about, it is putting you on the spot, okay. How do you think that these things that you've talked about could be applied in those situations to keep these Canadian ewes alive?
Okay, good question.
That's always.
So I mean, again, it comes back to, nutrition will help the animals. So what we're primarily dealing with when we're dealing with animals coming from outside going onto the pasture is that if you take away the larval challenge, their immunity wanes. And so effectively you're talking about a naive animal going out onto pasture. And that's effective that I presume it's the same for Homoncus, but certainly for temperate parasites, if we have an animal indoors, and we've shown this with ewes, they're 10 weeks without challenge, then they're pretty much completely susceptible. So larvae will and particularly T circumspecta will penetrate into the tissues and establish themselves in the meson. I can't imagine that Homoncus is any different. So from that perspective, nutrition will help in terms of their current level of nutrition will help them to replace losses, but it's not necessarily going to help them in terms of arming their immune response, because the immune response is quite costly. It requires a lot of resources. So if the animal doesn't need it, if it's not getting antigenic stimulus, it's going to stop producing antibodies, and it will wane. So if you're coming from an indoor situation where there's no challenge to an outdoor situation, you're basically providing a naive animal and sending them off into a it's like in the war when you're just sending someone off into the front line. So as the nutrition will help, if they're in a good level of nutrition, their current level of nutrition will help to replace some of those losses, but it's not going to help immediately in terms of preventing that first establishment, that first level of infection. It will help in terms of the speed of development of immunity, and you just got to hope that challenge isn't acute enough that it's killed them before then.
So is there any benefit, I guess I'm reading into what you're saying, in giving them some soya or something as you turn them out?
Yeah, so
or putting them onto some of these.
So yes, in terms of the speed of development of immunity. So they will develop the immune response, re-establish their immune response a lot faster. In terms of but that's going to take a couple of weeks, right? So for the first couple of weeks, then there's relatively little direct benefit apart from their ability to keep their blood protein levels up. you were,
Yeah, we do see dead sheep without being turned on in pasture, just because they have overwintering, larvae inside of the overwintering farms, right? And with the peripurturing time, they will actually develop hemoptysis and die before they've been turned on in pasture.
so these are ones that are lactating as well? Yeah, so, and that lactation demand is a massive drain on a ewe. And so you've got to imagine that, I mean, she's a giving sort, right? So she'll prioritize her resources to her offspring and sacrifice herself. And so if you got high demands for lactation, you know, they will wind down their own body reserves. They will put themselves at risk to give their offspring the best chance in terms of the milk production. So it is a high risk period.
So Kathy's talking about type 2 disease there, of course, which is slightly different. And again, I suppose it's just thinking outside the box a little bit and trying to think about any alternative ways that we can, or adjuncts that we can use to conventional treatments that might help reduce the risks.
Yeah, I mean, it might be type 2, it might be just ones that they've actively harbored as they came in as well.
Yeah.
And the lactation sort of worn down their own resilience.
Okay, so well, thank you, Andy, for that. So now I'd like to introduce Ailey Geddes. Ailey is I co-supervise her PhD, so she's one of my PhD students. Ailey's PhD is all about looking at farms as individual entities and trying to understand parasite control, trying to give out good parasite control advice to that works for individual farmers, and just understanding what the differences between farmers are, etc. And there's also a component of what Ailey's working on, which is about how to then get across messages in an effective way when it comes to advice on worm management in the face of anthelmintic resistance. So Ailey, over to you.
Oh, yes. Thank you everyone for coming along. I just wanted to start off by saying that I don't spend all of my time in the lab. Before flying over to Canada, I've spent the last couple of weeks in the lambing shed myself up in the very north of Scotland, and within 5 minutes of being in this building, I also find someone else who is originally from pretty much where I live, so it's a very small world. So I just wanted to give a quick overview of the kind of UK scenario. We've now heard from the New Zealand perspective, and the UK perspective does share some similarities, but also some differences. So the UK is quite a small island, and within that we actually have quite a big mix of farming enterprises, which is due to kind of a lot of different climates within even just quite a small area. We have a mix of kind of extensive flocks and also more intensive flocks. So the map on that side there, you can see the kind of darker areas are where we have more sheep in the country, and the lighter areas are where we have less sheep. In the north of Scotland, up at the top there, it's quite light, but that's due to having kind of more extensive flocks that we kind of have less of. And the lighter areas in kind of England there are more due to population, with kind of more intensive farms in England than in Scotland. We can see an example of these kind of contrasting farm types in the pictures at the bottom. So we have an example of a lowland farm in England with your kind of nice rolling English countryside, lots of grass, where you'd maybe be getting a good like 3 or 4 cuts of silage on a good year, to further north in Scotland, where you'd probably be lucky to get 1 good cut of silage if you're in the right place for it, with a lot more harsh environments. This is an example of an extensive island hill farm that I work with. Our flock size is a lot smaller than in New Zealand. Our average is around 400. This does seem very small, but we do have a lot of producers that have a couple of thousand sheep and breeding ewes. But that is contrasted as well with a lot of kind of smaller businesses that are more kind of hobby farms and crofts. with a few sheep, which really kind of brings that average down. So in terms of kind of grazing and management, we have a few different kind of farm types to kind of get through. Farming in the UK is quite diverse and quite hard to get into now. We have these kind of generational farms, which were traditionally passed from father to son. And really that's the only good way to get yourself a farm that you own. So it's quite difficult for new entrants to actually get into farming. Tenant farms are actually really commonplace. Your kind of contracts would be kind of 99 years, so kind of a lifetime and a half really for farmers. These are kind of owned by big estates or people with plenty of money to rent out a good couple of 100 acres for you to do with as you please. Also, what's quite unique to the Highlands and Islands of Scotland are these crofts. I put a little kind of picture at the bottom there of the best picture I could find of a croft, which is not particularly good. Essentially, it is a kind of strip of land that would be about 5 acres, and kind of everyone in the community would have one of these strips of land with a house at the end, and they would be able to support a family on that 5 acres of land. That kind of notion is long gone, but you know that is still a big part of those communities. And while these people who own these croft lands now will work alongside them, it still provides them with that sort of lifestyle. And increasingly for our producers that are young entrants that are trying to get into farming, rented grazing is increasingly common. This is just renting fields and being essentially what we would call a landless keeper, where you don't have any permanent grazing at all. You don't know the history of that farm or those fields, which makes it really difficult if you're looking to plan your parasite control and things like that. And it's a very limited way to farm. In the UK, the majority of our sheep are outside all year, but I would say at least over half are lambed indoors, particularly further south and with pedigree breeding. The more kind of extensive flocks will lamb outdoors, and these are sheep that, to be honest, wouldn't really cope with being indoors either. And but they're still lambed in kind of smaller fields with the farmers kind of watching over them. Just kind of an idea of our kind of typical farming year. Our lambing will occur anywhere between about March and June. We only really lamb once a year, that's enough. And that when you decide to lamb is really dependent on your climate. Some of the pedigree breeders will actually start lambing in around January or February to get the best big lamb they can for the show or the sale. But those of us with more sense lamb a little bit later on in the year when it's a little bit warmer. And those up further north will lamb even later still into May and June, and that's more your outdoor lambing. And then the kind of rest of the typical season follows if you're lambing late and shearing late due to these sort of climate related reasons. And as I said, the growing season is very dependent on your kind of land type here. Something that's quite interesting with farming at the moment in the UK, I mean, I'm sure you've all heard of Brexit. It's an interesting thing that's kind of happened to farming and has actually caused a lot of, well, it's going to be causing a lot of change, some of which has already started, but a lot we don't know. There's going to be significant changes to subsidies that are paid to farmers for farming, and farming in the UK is largely supported by these subsidies, with your hill and upland farmers on these kind of more extensive ground, only about the top 10% of those farmers are actually making any profit from their enterprise without subsidies. So it's really holding our industry up, but this is all changing now, and we can expect some changes that may be kind of beneficial or an opportunity for thinking a bit more about our parasite control. So in the UK, our parasite control is largely reliant on these wormers. We do have 5 classes available, like in New Zealand, but we don't have any of these combinations, so multi-active products. Well, apart from StarTect, which is multi-active. We have this figure on away there is shows you, this is a snippet from some of my PhD work, and it's just giving you an idea of how well our anthelmintics are working or not. That each one of those panels is a different drug type. So we have our benzimidazole at the top there, and that horizontal line is our 95% line above which we would say that our drug is working well. So we can see that for our benzimidazoles, none of those treatments that I followed on my farms were actually effective. Some were not terribly far off, but really inefficacy is on every farm. The one on the far left there is right, I think far right, is our levamisole, and that was generally working quite well on the farms, but in my project, only a couple of farms have been using them. Our macrocyclic lactone is kind of variable in how well it works, and why it's being used. It's kind of more, I've seen it more being used in use. Our monipantal, which is that bar with all of the ones in number 9, month 9, September. It's quite nice to see that at least it's working, but they're not all 100% efficacious, which, you know, it means we need to be watching and being responsible about our use of monipantal so we can actually, you know, prolong this for, prolong its use. And really, with resistance being on the up, something needs to change, as Andy was just saying. So just to give, before I jump into some strategies, a bit of a perspective on the parasite species we're seeing in the UK, just as this is something a bit different to what you'd be seeing in Canada. We don't really have a significant amount of Monchus. It's not our predominant parasite. Increasingly, it is becoming more of a problem in places like the south of England and some farms in the south of Scotland. But predominantly, this kind of teal coloured is our Telodysacia circumcincta, which is what we're seeing most of the year, with some of our Trigostrongylus species coming in kind of later in the season. And the kind of diversity that we're seeing and how many species we're seeing on these farms is very variable, dependent on their kind of past treatment history. So in terms of sustainable parasite control, we have a lot of options out there. Andy was speaking about TST, and we can use grazing management and target treatments like your DAG scoring and fecal soiling and fecal egg counts from ACHA. But these strategies all have different requirements and suitability dependent on the farming systems. And part of my project is to really look at how we can apply these strategies on farms and find where they would be appropriate based on kind of a combination of factors. So the things that kind of go into the development of these control strategies for these farms is knowing what parasites are there, what is the challenge, and are the treatments working? With the farms that I followed in my PhD, we've done quite extensive fecal egg count testing, and we've also been able to offer them information on the parasite species that are on their farm. This is something that's not unfortunately commercially available yet, but hopefully will be in the next couple of years or so. But that means nothing on its own without understanding the whole system that is in place on each of these farms. It's all fine and well for me to sit in the lab behind my computer and say this might work for you, but you know, every farm is different and has a different availability of labour. What's happened there beforehand? How much in-by grazing have they got? This is a type of kind of good ground on these sort of hill farms. Previous knowledge about parasite management, which is very variable. Access to animals on these kind of extensive hill flocks that I've followed. They may only be seeing their animals a few times a year at particular management events. Climate's a big driver. We have quite variable climate in the UK, nothing quite as extreme as Canada, but it's wet and it's miserable and sometimes it might be sunny. And access to technology is also a kind of major limiting factor as I said, these farming systems are often uneconomic, particularly in these sort of marginal areas. So I wanted to give you a couple of examples of the particular farms that I've been working with. This is a farm that's located just to the side of the Cairngorms. It's a quite high elevation, and they would see a lot more kind of classic winters, nothing quite as bad as Canada, but they will get a good hard frost and snow. And it won't be quite as mild the whole year round, and then they will get a kind of more considered slightly warmer period. How warm that is not very, but warmer. On this farm, we were seeing that there wasn't a significant real parasite burden through our fecal egg count work. But on this farm, they used 4 treatments of albendazole throughout the year, and that efficacy varied significantly from 0% to 97.5%, depending on when they tested. So we were able to go in with our species and have a look and see what was actually going on. So we can see that the top left bar there, the teal is the Telodysacia circumcincta, and that was a post-treatment sample. So about 2 weeks after they treated, that was the only species that had remained after treatment, and we didn't have that pre-treatment sample taken at time of treatment there. When they treated in August, which is the next box over, we can see that it was mostly that teal color again with the Telodysacia, and a few other different colors of Tubertia, Esophagostomum, and Trichostronchulus. But again, the same story where we just have that teal color left afterwards. And you can see that the egg count value, which is in the middle of the bar, went from 40 grams to 40 grams. So had a 0% reduction. But when they tested a little bit later, we can see that there was less of that teal color in the first box. And then their egg count actually dropped by about 60% from 50 eggs per gram to 18 eggs per gram. And that actually, when they then tested again, they used that same product again later on in the year, that you can hardly see that teal bar in amongst all the other colors of species that we've got here. And that treatment worked 97.5%. So we can see that how the species change really influences where those drugs are going to be useful on our farm, which means that even if you've got resistance, you might not have resistance all year round, depending on the species that are on your farm, which means you can still use these products if you know when to be using them, when they will be effective for your farm. Something that we also had a little bit of access to on one of our other farms was some weight gain data. This is, I would say, not very common for producers to have, particularly in our kind of hill and upland areas. But this farm is an extensive island hill farm. You can see in the pictures there, this is their kind of like boulder field. And this is, and the bottom is one of their better pastures, and they don't have very much of this ground at all. And as a bit of context, they would lamb and put them out on the hill with ewes and lambs into this sort of boulder field and the other 2,500 acres that they've got. They'll then gather in their sheep every so often for treatments and other activities like marking, like docking lambs and things like that. But they really struggle due to their topography to actually gather in all of the sheep at every time. On average, this farmer estimated that she'd miss about 10 to 20% every time she gathered, and it would take her 4 days to get all of those animals that she could in at that particular time. So she has a lot of struggles also beyond just the topography and climate on her farm as well. But what she really noticed here was that when she weaned these lambs, so took them off the hill and put them into these slightly better fields that she had, which didn't have very much of, that these lambs were not doing very well. And from our fecal egg count testing, we showed that these had a high fecal egg count in this kind of later season. And by using our weight data, we were able to see that this was indeed affecting lamb growth. And these dashed blue lines going upwards are every time she treated. And the green lines are sort of management events. So the first one there is when the lambs were weaned. So you can see that's kind of the peak of the growth curve here. So this kind of middle blue line there is the average lamb weight, and all of the mess in the background is every individual lamb. So we can see that when that first green line happens, the growth kind of knocks off, and there was a treatment applied there, and it does start to come back up again a little bit, but then it does drop off again then. So their high egg counts were really affecting the lamb growth here, and we were able to see that the in-by grazing here was a challenge, and start to think about how we can manage the limited ground that this farmer has to actually better manage a parasite challenge to hopefully improve lamb growth. So something that has really been the workhorse of my PhD has been fecal egg counts. And in fact, they are the whole workhorse of veterinary parasitology. Our lab at Morden will do about 10,000 egg counts a year, and that's just for research purposes. And they are quite accessible to farmers and fairly cheap, although perhaps not cheap enough to really be used particularly regularly. There are significant benefits of prolonged fecal egg count monitoring that I've been able to demonstrate throughout my PhD and through these long-term fecal egg count reduction tests. But something that I really wanted to look at was, how do we ensure that farmers are getting the most out of these results? Often we find in the UK, these tests are not done by vets, but they're sent out to private labs. They're done by independent fecal egg count providers. And the information that these farmers will actually be getting back from that can be very variable, from a quick phone call with the vet saying 600 eggs per gram, that's quite high, probably treat, or even a text message saying 600 eggs per gram, high. Or, you know, you might have a full-on discussion with your vet, but increasingly there are also more farmers that have a microscope at home and are doing a more DIY approach. So we wanted to make sure that there's something in place for farmers to be able to interpret these well, to decide whether they need to treat, do I have resistance, and also start to collect some of this data to refer back to create this sort of long-term picture. You know, we went and visited the farms that I work with over the course of last year, and a lot of them had printed out, you know, some of their results, and which was quite nice to see, and, you know, put information in the hands of the farmers, and, you know, let them. So what we kind of came up with was a figure to help the interpretation of egg count results. So in kind of first year of my PhD, I'm now kind of in my third year now. So I was sending results to farmers in a table. That's great, but what does 900 mean? You know, it's really hard to see the distribution in actually those counts and really infer what does this mean for my sheep. And that's why we've moved towards this graph. So this graph, or the gradient, the kind of traffic light gradient in the background, is giving an indication of the potential clinical impact. I'd like to caveat this and say that this is without the presence of homuncus, as they can really change your egg counts, as they're really high egg laying parasite. So this is based on kind of current industry advice, this gradient. Each one of those dots is an individual sample, and the line there is the group average. So this allows you to see easily, is it just one sheep that's maybe got a really high challenge and the rest of them are all kind of sitting quite low? Could that have pulled up my average? Or are they all kind of sitting fairly along the middle, and is my whole kind of flock at the same level of infection? I know this can start thinking about questions of, oh, well, if there are a couple that are high, maybe I need to be identifying those animals and, you know, culling them from the flock. And, you know, just start thinking a bit more about what these really mean. And this also calculates the percentage reduction if you've done post-treatment testing. And it also calculates a confidence interval as well, which is just kind of how certain we are that that is a true representation of the reduction there. So as I said, I then took this and created some results reporting, which I can take in the lab and produce and give to my farmers in less than 2 minutes after finishing my egg counts. And I feel like this is something that means a lot more to them than that table ever could. And that table took me about 5 times as long to put together. So, I think this is quite a mutually beneficial solution for these farmers to start thinking about what's next. And as I was saying, we went and visited these farmers and they'd all printed out their reports that I'd sent them over a whole year, and we could sit and compare them. And it was really nice to see that they were starting to think about this too. But I work with 9 farmers. There are a lot more farmers in the UK and all over the world than that 9 farmers. So I really wanted to have a sort of legacy from this sort of project and created an app for egg counts. So this was only in about November, December time. I developed a prototype for some focus groups to take to farmers, vets and advisors and see what they thought of this sort of idea. Farmers are able to input their results, receive an easy visual, accompanied by relevant advice and resources provided by those in the industry that have this kind of reliable information. You can put in monitoring egg counts, like one-off egg counts, efficacy testing using either individual samples or pooled samples. And the hope was that this would also standardize results reporting and take the text or the email or the phone call you got from the vet into something that you can collate and keep and record. We then took these in January, February time to some focus groups. And I really think this quote at the top sums it all up. We as farmers need the ability to turn data into information, into knowledge, and that's what an app should be able to do. I was somewhat surprised by the positivity that we actually had around this idea, and in some ways was quite proud that the farmers who had only been shown the app 5 minutes before were really able to see the potential of this sort of, I was going to say technology, but even just simple visual to improve their parasite management, saying, oh, well, this would be great, but then if you added this in, this could make it even better. And if I could store this data, that would, and thinking about what's next and what they could really be doing with this. And, farmers saying that if they had the app, they'd be more likely to do fecal egg count testing. But sum it all up, if it's easy to use, I'll use it. So the result of our prototype and focus groups was launching our app called Fact Check. You're welcome to scan the QR code and have a go and have a play around with it. It was only launched on Friday. It still has very many teething issues, but in the next couple of weeks, hopefully it'll settle down and it will be widely available. It collates a lot of resources that have been developed by the kind of SCOPS, which is our Sustainable Control of Parasites in Sheep organisation in the UK, and also from Morden themselves. And we made some improvements to accessibility and design, included post-drench checks for those farmers who maybe didn't do a test at the time that they were actually treating the animals, but want to see if it worked. And also, if you have resistance, what do you do next? There was a decision tree that's been signed by the industry SCOPS there, with a little decision tree for managing multiple antibiotic resistance. And yeah, you're welcome to have a go and have a go at the link there and see what you think.
Might need to add a focus function.
Baby steps.
Say that's
Oh, need to add a homunculus, but I said baby steps. But yeah, that is all. Yeah.
So you indicated that you doing a combination drug, you have StarTech.
Yeah.
Is this a political reason? Is this a government reason why you don't have more combination drugs like our good friends in New Zealand have? Because we don't have them either.
I mean,
That is scope that he has available.
we're just asking why we don't have combinations in the UK. And I mean, my response in some ways is, why do we want them if we still, we want to be managing our parasites well, so we don't need to be using combinations to get to a point where we're not actually so reliant on these anthelmintics for our control and thinking about other solutions rather just more drugs. You know, as Andy said, you know, they've got triple resistance to all combinations.
Not even,
Well,
just some.
just most of them. But you know, drugs aren't going to solve our issue.
To come back on that, it is a political thing, in that there have been lots of attempts to get actual combination products licensed, but they have been turned down at every stage by our veterinary medicines directorate. And it's because of fears about whether or not there's interactions within those combinations, and maybe that's actually, those fears have been founded. There's beginning to be some talk coming out of New Zealand that those sorts of things might happen. We do still use combinations, and we use combinations in particular as quarantine treatments, but rather than use combinations coming out of the bottle, we use combinations as sequential drenches. And that's the only way in which we can use combinations. We have combinations. We have combinations of fluke and wormers and things like that, but wormer combinations, that was a political thing. And yeah, it was brick wall on that one.
Yeah, happy to take any more questions in the room if there's any.
Any more questions for Ellie? Well, Ellie, thank you very much. Great. And some of you may have noticed on Ainley's last slide, which has now disappeared, there was
Okay, I can put it back.
yes, please. There was a beautifully painted life-size model of a sheep, and this is one of about 30 of these that have been they've all consigned famous artists, and that includes Ailey, to draw and paint these sheep up with themes that were relevant to Scottish agriculture. And these sheep are now touring the country and things. And the theme on Ailey's one is on the back of the sheep. There's a picture of the beautiful countryside and everything that we have. And it continues round to the front where we've got some scab mites, some liver flukes and some worms, and it's to draw attention to just how these parasites sort of interact with the environment and the way in which we keep sheep in those environments. So this is touring Scotland, and we'll end up at the Highland Show in July. So I'd now like to introduce, having introduced my PhD student, I'd like to introduce my former PhD supervisor, which becomes a little bit awkward and thing. But anyway, John was my PhD supervisor. John Gilliard is now Professor of Parasitology at University of Calgary, and John's going to talk to you about some of the state-of-the-art research that's being done in terms of parasitology, asking the question about where does that fit in on your farms and things. And as you said with Andy, please interrupt and ask him questions and things as you go along.
But repeat the question.
I won't remember. Okay, well, thank you, Neil, for that introduction. I always point out, though, that I learned more off Neil than he learned off me. I'm sure that's very true. So, yeah, I put together these slides, and Andy and Elodie have given a great broad sweep of a number of points. So what I talk about might not totally match my slides, because I want to draw out some extra issues as we go, because there's no point covering ground that's already been covered. And again, I encourage people just to ask questions as we go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Western Canadian perspective on this. Just to give us our bearings, you all know this, but it's just to introduce some of the things I'm going to talk about. And obviously, when we think about these worms and sheep, we've got a lot of different species. The big one we worry about, as everybody said, is Haemonchus contortus in terms of acute disease. But then we've got these other ones, which are also present, which mainly cause diarrhea, and there's a whole mix of them. And when we do egg counts, they all look the same. And so one of the things I want to talk about is the limitations of that in terms of monitoring what's going on, and in terms of monitoring resistance and diagnosing resistance and deciding what to do about it. And I guess the case I'm trying to make, and Elodie's already given
a great couple of examples of it is, if with, one would argue without being able to break these things down by species, you're really limited in terms of making evidence-based decisions. So that's going to be one of the take-home messages. Again, when we look at climate here, and again, this was discussed already, but just to contrast it with the New Zealand and UK situation, as you all know, with the climate in Canada as a whole, and particularly so in Western Canada, we have a very short growing season, a very short period of time where Homunculus can develop on the pastures. And so the transmission season is very tight. And because of that, in the winter, there's very little exposure, immunity wanes over that housing period. And then when you turn them out, quite often you turn them out into conditions where the conditions are pretty optimal for Homunculus development, albeit just for a few months. And really, to go from an egg to an L3 under optimal conditions, it takes around 5 days is the minimum development time. So those numbers can build up very, very quickly. And it's already been pointed out, you've got inhibited larvae which can react to it. So in Canada as a whole, we have this pattern of animals every year losing immunity, turning out, and then being slammed with large numbers of parasites on pastures. Just to visualize that, this is running a predictive model. This is Mohammed Bilal, who's a graduate student in the lab, who's worked with colleagues in the UK who've developed this predictive model of Homunculus transmission. And if you look over the seasons, you see the seasonality very clearly based on climate data. So this is essentially the variability here is driven by precipitation and temperature, and you can see over that period how it changes. So again, when we think of Canada as a whole, just kind of tiling that out, you can see it's quite a big difference between Eastern Canada and Western Canada in terms of that transmission series. Here in Southern Ontario, if you look at that part, you can see you've got a much longer transmission season than we have. But nevertheless, I always have to point this out to people, probably not here, but elsewhere in the world, that we do see clinical hemoncosis. It's a major problem for our producers. And again, it's counterintuitive for some people from different parts of the world because they assume the climate here is not conducive. So this has been talked a lot about in different ways, and Andy talked about all these alternative strategies, which are on the bottom segment here. But the bottom line of this is, over the years, quite understandably, we've been very reliant on chemical control, and we need to move towards these more integrated control measures. And a lot of stuff that Andy talked about, really, any one of these things is not going to provide a solution, but combined, we're looking to combine these things to then get better and more sustainable management. And what I'm going to focus on in this talk is the resistance issue in relation to how we use the drug. So that top left, this part of the pie, if you like. Andy's already alluded to some of these. So the argument I'm trying to push, I guess, is that we need a culture change in parasite control away from what we've been doing in the past, which is treat first, to a diagnose first approach. And so that's a big culture change, because there's always a tendency to think, well, to be on the safe side, we'll treat, we'll use these drugs, particularly if they're relatively cheap and available. To move away from that, to go to a much more targeted evidence-based approach. And the other way to look at this is thinking of anthelmintics differently is, particularly things like ivermectin and fenbendazole, they've become pretty cheap and available. And we're thinking there's low-value products and therefore, in the past, high use. What we should be thinking about these drugs is much higher value and use them a lot less. And some of those new drugs which are coming out that we're talking about, and I'll come to that in a minute, are actually quite expensive, right? So that kind of drives it as well. And that, I would argue, I mean, it's probably not a popular thing to say, but that's not a bad thing in a way, because although they're more expensive per unit, if you're using a lot less of them, the net cost is not potentially more. It's just you're using less of them in more targeted fashion. and therefore they're more sustainable. So the drugs we've got in Canada, I'm sure most people in the room know this, but just to give us our bearings, you know, we've got these two broad spectrum dewormer classes, the fenbendazole, albendazole, which are the benzimidazoles, and the ivermectin, which are a member of the macrocyclic lactone group. And we've had these obviously for decades, and we've been the mainstay of control for a long time. And then in Canada, 2016, we got closental. And the key thing to remember about closental, it's a very narrow spectrum drug. It just kills homuncus essentially, not those other species. So it's really important to be aware of that. And then 2018, we got Startec, which is this combination of Dequantel and ivermectin, which is a quite expensive but highly effective drug. But I think many of you will be aware that that's now just become unavailable. And I think we don't know when it's going to become available again, probably not in the next 12 months. Yeah.
Amazon will have it.
No, I don't actually. I think, yeah.
I know it's.
So, no, I mean, it's an interesting whole conversation about these drugs, right? Because producing these drugs is actually, you know, they're produced at one or two places in the world, right? So the supply to Canada comes from sometimes the UK, sometimes Australia, depending on the drug. And it's true about a lot of animal health pharmaceuticals. And so the supply chain is quite vulnerable. And these things are quite difficult to produce in quantity. And when the demand is high, then you get supply problems. And lots of countries have supply on and off supply problems with these drugs from time to time. Canada's not in the best of shape for the sheep products, because obviously for the pharmaceutical companies globally, it's a smaller market. And so, you know, sometimes you could argue, you know, Canada's one of the first to get hit with supply problems.
Selling it in a small package might be beneficial for Canada. Since a lot of
Yeah. Yeah, and we'll come on to that, and Paula can maybe speak more to that. Oh, sorry. Yes. The question is, sorry, and I didn't, what was the first question? I didn't repeat it.
What about it?
Yeah, what was it? That's good. Okay, so I'll repeat that. So, what was the question?
More practical for it to be available.
Yes, that was the question. Yeah, so would it be more practical to be available in smaller units? And the answer is yes. But the veterinarian can split units depending on the product and the supply. Yeah, that's absolutely right. So I don't disagree, it would. But again, it's all to do with cost of goods and profit margins and all that stuff, right? But certainly for the producers, yeah, clearly. And certainly you look at the sheep and goat industry here, there's lots of people with small numbers of animals. So, you know, basically it's really dependent on the veterinarian splitting product really at the moment. But Paul's way more knowledgeable about the practicalities of that than I am as part of all. But
Continue.
okay, fair enough.
John, what's the question?
Yeah.
Okay, we should have this conversation because it's going to come up, right? So like this summer coming up in 23, we've got safeguard and Ivermectin.
Yeah.
And we have a homuncus outbreak.
Yeah.
We don't have Startec.
Yeah.
We have a problem.
We do. We do.
You go
Yeah.
with the emergency drug release to get something in, like Cydantic or something like that.
Yeah. This one, we'll come to it. Let's
This is the problem.
yeah. So I'll repeat the comment. Somebody's made the comment that because we've now lost Startec in Canada, we have a serious problem because if we have a homuncus outbreak, we don't have many choices. There is closental, which is highly effective, and we'll come back to this, but that is our only choice at the moment. And that's one of the things I want to talk about as we go through. But point is well taken. I'm going to come on the next slide to another aspect of this now. And so, yeah, we'll draw that, we'll come back and forth on that point as we go. So, yeah, but it's a point well taken. Any other? That's not, okay, so yeah, just to emphasize that, I keep wanting to point to the slides, but I'll do it here. Just to emphasize, this narrow spectrum drug is, we don't have, and I'll show a little bit of data on this, I think. We don't have much resistance to closental. in Homunculus yet, as far as I'm aware. It will come, and that's one of the issues about how we use these drugs. So there are other dewormers, and we've heard in New Zealand and the UK, some of these are available. Zolvix is monopantal, and there are efforts at the moment to try and get that available on emergency drug release. And our Lanco, yeah, there we go, can speak to that at the end, right? You're going to speak specifically to that issue, that may well become available sometime in the next few months, hopefully sooner rather than later, on emergency drug release. And there are also efforts to get Zolvix Plus licensed in Canada, but that's a more longer term project over the next year or two. So there are efforts underway to try and deal with this issue. But again, actually, to echo what Andy said, it's critical we don't just jump onto the next drug and do that. And one thing I will say about monopantal is resistance to this drug arguably occurs more rapidly than some of the others. In some parts of the world, it's occurred very rapidly, within a year or two, in some cases of use. So it's absolutely critical it's used in the appropriate fashion. Otherwise, it'll just go very quickly. So that's the other choice, perhaps coming soon. And then we've got Sidectin, which is moxidectin, and levamazole. And these are not available in Canada at the moment. So that's basically the drugs you've got, which is obviously very limited compared to other places. So how we use these drugs is critical, and we'll come back to it as we go. I wanted to just talk a little bit about the Western Canadian situation to illustrate all this. We've had a project running since 2015, where we've had a series of DVM and BSc students cycling through the lab each year. Libby, who's sat here, has been central to this project, as Camilla Quiros has as well. And my colleague Michelle Levy, who's unfortunately just retired from the University of Calgary, who's a small ruminant clinician, or a ruminant clinician. So what we've done with this project, and I won't go into the details, but essentially what we've done is we've two things: used it to develop some technologies, which I'll come on to in a minute. And we've also used it to look at the situation in Western Canada, which hadn't really been looked at before for many, many years. And so what we did is we got producers, we managed to get about 40 or 50 producers involved, where we sent out sampling packs, got them to sample pre and post treatment. We did the fecal egg counts, applied these technologies, as I'll say, for the species identification, and then looked at the situation of drug efficacy and how effective producer applied treatments were. We also visited farms and did some proper fecal egg count reduction tests to look at the resistance situation in Western Canada. One of the other things we did is we produced this website, which is hopefully going to be the home of research updates. So it's not to duplicate what the fantastic work Paula has done, which is much more extensive on like a management manual, but it's really to update things specifically for Western Canada, but also hopefully update research as we go. So talk a little bit about technology, and I'm not going to go into detail. It's the concept which is critical here, and some of the results that Elodie showed uses this technology, and so it's really only just become available the last year or two, I guess. Well, 3 or 4 years maybe, in terms of it being more widely used. But the idea is, by using these new DNA sequencing technologies, we can much more rapidly and easily, on a much larger scale, identify the different species in a sample. So in terms of extracting, I keep wanting to walk over there. In terms of extracting samples, we extract out the eggs or the larvae out of the samples. We make DNA from them. We can do it at scale in these 96-well plate formats. And then we can sequence essentially all the parasites in the sample that comes out of a fecal sample and tell what species it is. So I'm going to show a few charts to illustrate a few points about how useful this is, or how important it is to do this, which kind of look like this thing on the end there. So you see a color code for the different species. you see the top one, which is the fecal egg count, and then the proportions of the different parasite species, which essentially comprise that egg count. So it's broken down by species. The power of this for surveillance is shown here, and these are just samples that producers sent in, just pre-treatment. And you can see with those colours, the red jumps out. That's Homunculus, obviously, which you can see is the predominant one, as you would imagine. But it's also worth pointing out there's other species in there. In some forms, if you look on the particular time we sampled them, those other species are predominant, right? So you can't guarantee on a fecal egg count that it's Homunculus you're looking at, which is key. And I'll illustrate what that means for monitoring drug resistance as well. So the risk of hemoncosis isn't really given by the simple egg count. And actually, for a variety of reasons, it's not the most reliable measure. So just to give an idea of the fecal egg count reduction test we did, again, it's a table rather than a graph. I apologize for that. But this is just a summary of where we saw resistance for these different species. And so for Homunculus, you can see for ivermectin, 11 out of the 13 forms we visited had resistance. 9 out of 10 for fenbendazole had resistance. So you can say in Western Canada, and I'm pretty sure it's the same here because we've got data, those two drugs are not going to work very well against Homunculus, full stop. So fortunately, levamisole, or rather unfortunately because we don't have it, we didn't see much resistance to that, moxidectin similar. But what's important, and again, Elliot kind of alluded to a similar thing, is if you look at the different species, it's quite a different story. So if you look at Telidoisagia, which is the commonest one of these others, which causes more diarrheal and growth impacts, we've got some ivermectin resistance, a lot less, but actually fenbendazole still works very well against that parasite. And similarly for the other common parasite of that group, Trichostrongylus. So it comes back to the fact that, okay, the wide drenches, fenbendazole, are not going to do much for your Homunculus, but they're still effective against those other species. So it's really important to know what species you're dealing with, not just to understand the risk, but also to start making rational choices about drugs. The thing is, the other point, general point I want to make is, you know, when I came in 2008, actually, and this may surprise some people in the room from the UK and started talking about resistance in parasites and the rest of it, a surprising number of vets and producers said, well, we don't think we've got such a big problem with resistance. And that was in 2008. They knew they had Homunculus problems, but the resistance wasn't characterized. And the story always got, well, we only treat once a year or twice a year, perhaps. So it's not like New Zealand or the UK. And so why is there so much resistance here? And probably the reason is there's been a tendency to treat the whole flock at once and to treat in the spring. And when you do that with ewes, practically all the parasites are inside the ewe. So you're applying very strong selection. In contrast, later in the year, where there's loads of parasites on the pasture, you're applying the drug to the animals. There's still a lot of parasites in the ecosystem which don't see the drug. And so that's a less strong selection pressure. So treating that one treatment, so the timing of the treatment and the fact of treating all the animals is the thing which is providing the really strong selection. So we need to get away from those kind of standard things of treat all the ewes in the spring. Do you need to treat them? And then the comments about Homunculus and the disease risk, and the earlier comment was very good about, yeah, but it's a risky business. So there's a whole conversation to be had there, how you make that decision. But if you are treating the spring, it's critical to try and use these refugia targeted selective treatment approaches and build that into a program. So that's just a general comment. So we supply this info as well as doing these large scale studies and try and look at the general situation. Through my colleague Michelle Levy, we feed this information back to producers who've been involved in the study. And so I think it has helped increase awareness and if you like, the interest in having a more kind of rational approach to parasite control. And so, but this is very much part of a research project. It's not a service, it's people engaging in the project. So I wanted to give just a few examples as to why the species ID is important. So this is an example of just looking at ivermectin treatment, pre and post treatment on 3 different forms. And you can see in all those cases, you've got pretty much significant egg counts post-treatment relative to pre-treatment. The drug didn't work very well. So when you look at the species in this case, you can see in each of these cases, that treatment, what's surviving it? It is Homoncus. So on those 3 forms, you've got ivermectin resistant Homoncus, and that's not surprising. In hindsight now, we know that it's so common in the region. But if you compare that to closental, which is this drug that, answering the question, is now or only one available at this moment, which is going to be effective against Homoncus. You do your treatment, you look pre and post treatment. It doesn't look like it's worked very well on these 3 forms. Is it resistance? What do I need to worry about? What does that mean? You can't tell from the egg counts. But when you layer on the species information, you can see in each case, the Homoncus, the drug is doing what it's supposed to do. The Homoncus before treatment is gone, after treatment in all 3 cases. The reason you've still got these egg counts is these other species are present. So this is not resistance, this is the fact that on these particular forms, it's not just Homoncus there, it's these other species. So yeah, you're controlling Homoncus, but you're not controlling the parasites with closental. And we don't know the implications if you completely relied on closental for years, what would happen to these other species as well. That's a whole other topic. One more example, just to illustrate the point. This is, and again, it's a little bit like Elodie's example, not at different times of year, but different years. So as part of the study, we had this flock where we done fecal egg count reduction tests on for the different drugs, and you can see in 2017 benzimidazole, ivermectin seemed to work very well. Closental, not so much. Moxidectin, yeah. Then went back in 2018. Actually, benzimidazole and ivermectin didn't work as well as they should, and that seemed very rapid. And this is just StarTech, which did work well. So what's going on there? Is that surprising? Turns out that partly because of a lack of history taking on our part, the grazing of those sheep that year and that part of the flock was on a completely different set of pastures to the following year. And so if you look at the predominant species in this group this year, it was all Tilidocergic, or mainly Trichostrongus colubriformis. Whereas in 2018, it was a lot more Homoncus and Tilidocergia. So different species present in different years because of the pastures that were being utilized. So again, it just shows that there's a lot more complexity under the surface there that we can't tease out. And again, it goes back to the point, you do these tests at different times of year. If you don't have all the information, it's really puzzling in terms of what's going on. So the kind of feedback we can do with these tests is give a profile for the different parasites, for the different drugs, in terms of their resistance profile. So so this is part of a research to what we're doing now, and this is what I would like, so we can have some discussion and feedback on, is we're changing the platform, we're using a bit, the details don't matter, but to try and take this out of just a research tool that we engaging producers can benefit from that collaboration, to try and make it much more into a diagnostic, routine diagnostic that you could get this information basically like any diagnostic test in terms of sending samples in, pay cost, get the information back. So some discussion around that in terms of the interest in that, what's the price point and those kind of things. And so we can have a little bit of discussion about it at the end. So rather than going on, because I don't want to kind of tire everybody out, just put a few points down here, including things like quarantine treatments and things like that. If this triggers any thoughts, then just use that to ask questions. One final thing before we open up to discussion is Paul did ask me to bring up another thing just before I stepped up here. So we had a discussion earlier today about, you know, how resistance evolves in the early stages. And we don't really know, but the evidence we've got, the genetic evidence we've got, and I'm not going to go into the research per se, it's just the bottom line, suggests that in the very early stages of resistance, it probably starts quite focally in the early stages. So if you imagine a drug like Monopantel, which is going to be launched in Canada soon, probably, or at least available in Canada soon, as that starts to get used, as resistance emerges, it's probably going to appear in a few places. And then it's the animal movement which seeds those resistant parasites around, even before you start to see any problems. So by the time you start to see the first farm or two with problems, it's probably gone quite wide. So that's a really critical thing, and it makes us think hard about, with these new products, not only using these targeted treatments and using less of them and only using them when we need to, but what should we do about quarantine dosing and those kind of issues to try and maintain these drugs as long as possible? And that's another discussion that I'm always interested in people's thoughts on that. So anyway, that's a bit of a stream of consciousness, but rather than just go through all these different points and different things, I'd be more interested to hear from people's comments and questions. Thank you.
I'll start off with a comment. I mean, this is, sorry, this is all great. And this stewardship that you've got up here is of paramount importance when it comes to using these drugs for preventive purposes. But Vince asked the question, what happens when his animals are dying of disease? Yeah. And in those situations, none of these come into it, because when these animals are dying, you just need to go for an effective drug. You need to know that you've got an effective drug and you need to use it. And there's no selection pressure for resistance there, because by the definition, by the time they're dying, there's already plenty parasites in refugia anyway, and so we need that. But I suppose that highlights why we need to make sure that we have an effective drug available for that purpose. And I suppose, you know, it moves on to where we're about to come to with Elanco and with the fact that it looks like Zolvix will become available here. It is of absolute paramount importance that that drug remains effective. It hasn't really, well, it's remained effective from a practical perspective, but we already see in the UK resistance to Monopantel. We saw it within about 4 years of it being introduced. In New Zealand, it was seen within 2 years of it being introduced. It's seen everywhere around the world that it's been introduced. Now, you have a great opportunity here in Canada. Something else, just to go off at a slight tangent, but it's relevant, is a lot of those technologies that we're depending on, the things that have become the sort of workhorse of what we do, were actually developed here in Canada. When John talks about some of these research tools, they were developed, they were conceived and developed here in Canada. And you also here in Canada are way ahead of the curve in terms of the level of advice that you have available to you. You're way ahead of the curve in terms of the, and Ailey's nodding and things, in terms of the amount of work and understanding that's already been done in terms of these parasites. So I think that, to me, that really highlights the importance of what's on this slide and how that relates to everything else that's been talked about, in terms of just making absolutely sure that when you get this new drug, that you can actually keep it going for more than the 2 years that they kept it going for in New Zealand, or 4 years that we kept it going for.
You've just triggered a thought, actually.
Yeah,
Can I interrupt?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I'm finished. I'm finished. Mine was a
No,
comment.
no,
So off you go.
it triggered a thought as you were speaking, because one of the things that we're discussing, and Paul's involved in these discussions, is as monopantal becomes available, what advice should we be giving and guidelines about its use? And we're still discussing that, I guess. One of the things you could argue, and I would argue from a scientific point of view, is you should always use it in combination with closental, right? Because you've got two drugs. We don't think there's much closental resistance out there yet. There could be some starting to emerge that we're not yet picking up. Using the two drugs together, actually one drug protects the other. So in the sense that combinations are good in the early stages of resistance. So as long as both drugs are highly effective and there's very little or no resistance to them, they will protect each other. So there is a whole argument that, you know, maybe you should be using monopantal or Zolvex only in combination with closental. The other,
Except if the chemistry matches.
yeah,
So-
but there is some issues. But before I come to the question, I'll come just to finish the thought. So using so the other reason to use the combination as well is because of the other species, because closental on its own is all, you know, so I don't think you should be using closental on its own necessarily, or monopental on its own. Using the combination might be one of the pieces of advice. There's a number of nuances to exactly that in terms of those things, and that's why I'm not standing here today saying this is the advice, but these are the things we're discussing at the moment, is how do we protect these things? Question.
Sorry, just clarity, when you say combining them.
Yeah.
You mean like actually treating them together?
No.
Alternating
No.
between like
No.
treatments or
No.
like what's the combination?
Question.
Like,
You want me to repeat it for you?
what's treatment phase or what's
Yeah,
the
good
combination?
questions. Yeah.
So the question surrounds how do we use combinations? What do we mean by using combinations? Do we mean sequential or together?
Yeah, it's absolutely good question, because I forgot to clarify. So we're talking about using them immediately sequentially. So you treat with one, and then you treat with, you don't mix them together. Because, oh, sorry, yeah. Jeez. I need to walk around. Yeah, so you don't use them, you don't mix them together, because then you have real problems potentially with affecting all the pharmacokinetics and drug availability and all that stuff. So you treat with them sequentially, right? So and you treat them one, and then you can dose another at the same handling, but they need to be kept separate. But there are complexities to it. You probably know more than that, because
Well,
New
no,
Zealand.
I don't know more about it because I'm not a I know very little about pharmacokinetics. I don't even know how to spell that word, but from what I understand though, is that you have to be, sometimes you might also have to be very careful that if you are to be dosing and then at a very short space of time dosing the same animal again, because even though you're not mixing it in the container here, it's still mixing inside the rumen. And that's, I'm not saying that they will, the chemistry won't match, but there may need to be there may be some consideration as to how long between the doses there needs to be to make sure that they don't stuff each other up.
And
That's basically all I'm saying.
Yeah, and this is one of the things on this, right? We don't necessarily have the data on that now, right? And that's the problem, right? Because those detailed studies have not been done. Having said that, you know, I know you've alluded to some issues coming up in New Zealand on this point, right? But generally speaking, that sequential dosing is considered in most cases to work effectively, right? So for most of these combinations, it's fine, but yeah.
Yeah, but so I mean, considering the time between is something that needs to be.
Yeah.
that needs to be-
I was just gonna say, there's another point, and that's how long the drug works. Cause if one runs out before the
Yeah.
other,
Absolutely, yeah. So so Paul made the point, it depends on the drugs in terms of how long they last, in terms of in the animal at different levels. And so if one is much shorter acting than the other, then you end up with, a tail effect in the sense that then you're down to one drug for a period of time. So there are all these issues, which is why I'm not standing here today saying this is what you need to do. But these are the discussions, and I think I would say that, you know, when the advice comes out, it's, you know, we've got to try and encourage everybody to think hard about doing it if we want to protect these drugs. Yes, sorry.
So, well, there was a follow-up just to that question there,
Yeah.
and then Kathy's.
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, sorry, I guess also, like, I know you're kind of hesitating to say exactly what to do, of course.
Yeah.
But, if someone was looking at combining two different, in sequentially like that, you think that would be full doses of both?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because you're relying on, and one of the things that, and I think somebody's alluded to it already, underdosing, i.e. giving less than a full therapeutic dose, is a risk factor for selecting for resistance.
Right.
So what you're trying to do, I mean, you know, if you think about the genetics of it in simple terms, if you've got a worm and these resistance mutations are extremely rare in the population, the chances of that having resistance to both is, you know, orders of magnitude less than to one. So using a full dose of both means it's going to be extremely rare to have resistant parasites to both, providing you're dealing with a good starting point of the two drugs being highly effective in that. In Canada, we're lucky in that sense, right? Because we've not used these drugs. Well, closental not much yet. Started on panto not at all. Yeah. In general, you see, that's a very good question. I mean, I think yeah, we're still discussing, but I would argue, yeah, I would argue. Oh, sorry, the question.
So we'll repeat the previous question, which is that we need to use a full dose of both. And this question is about, does this pertain to quarantine or to its use in general?
Yeah, and yeah, so with the caveats Andy's made, logically, it would be in general, just to protect the drive, right? Certainly for quarantine, because again, you want to really minimize the chance of bringing resistant parasites onto your property, particularly against these two drugs, because, you know, it's ivermectin, you've already got them, so that's an issue, but these two drugs for sure. But logically, in terms of just drug use, these combinations will minimize the rate at which resistance develops. So yeah.
Against Haemoncus, of course, the resistance that's been seen in monopantal elsewhere around the world has been in
And we had that
strong.
conversation, yeah.
Yeah.
And the problem is, yeah, Neil's quite right. We're talking about Haemoncus here. You add the other parasites in, because Clausental's narrow spectrum, you're only using one drug against those other parasites. So you could argue adding a third drug in would be even better, right? But then that's the north form of the conversation, and your points become even more complex, right? So I'm sorry there isn't a clear answer stood here. But you know, it's one of these things, is what's going to be the best judgment call on this is in the next little while. Yeah.
So we expect a clear answer next week.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, time is of essence here. Right? Let's
Yeah.
be brutally honest.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, spring's not far away, and
Yeah.
supply issues are supply issues, and you know, we got to kind of
Yeah.
get ourselves ready with an answer or a solution.
Yeah. I mean, I actually think personally, so the question is, we need an answer quickly to you know, it's all very well me saying don't have a clear-cut answer today, because time's of the essence, and particularly this time of year, it's absolutely. So I mean, I think the point is we're all going to have to come out with guidelines for that's been discussed, and we will. My personal view at the moment, from what I know, is the combination is likely to be the thing I would argue for, with your caveats. That's what I would say. But I'm not gospel on this. It's we need to discuss amongst a number of experts, and these points have been raised. We need to make sure we're giving the best advice possible. About to say something, Paul? No, I thought you were going.
Okay, well, thanks, John. I think we'll maybe end up revisiting this, because I'd now like to invite Tamara to come up and to talk a little bit about this from the perspective of Elanco, who also we need to thank for providing the refreshments that we've had this evening. So thank you very much for that. But yes, perhaps a slightly different perspective, or perhaps the same perspective on what's happening.
Thank you. So my name is Tamara Hofstad. I'm a veterinarian, but I'm also the Director of Regulatory Affairs for Elanco. So my team has actually been working, thanks to the efforts of the veterinarians who've spoken with Dr. Menzies and Dr. Peregrine. We've been working with the Veterinary Drugs Directorate, the VDD, for a couple of months now to try and find access to Zolvix or Zolvix Plus for producers and veterinarians in Canada. Zolvix Plus is not going to be an option for Canada until at least 2026. So we can't rely on that. Sorry, Paula. There is no drug to share with Canada, but we do have an avenue for Zolvix. So I'm not going to talk about the merits and benefits and dosing of Zolvix, but I do want to talk about the path that makes it available to you. So veterinarians will have access only through the emergency drug route. So it is not going to be commercially available through your purchasing groups. It will only be through an emergency drug registration. So my request to the veterinarians here tonight is, if you have flocks where you have identified a need, please put your emergency drug release in now. I cannot bring drug into the country until the VDD acknowledges there's need, and they won't acknowledge there's need until you put your EDR in. So if you can get your EDR in, I'm not kidding, in the next 2 weeks, that allows me to bring product into Canada. So I have 200 1-liter units reserved for Canada. They're sitting in England. They have to be released by the government there in the middle of May, approved by the government here, and then shipped. So you need to have producer names on your EDR. Generally, the VDD asks for 1 EDR per producer. In this situation, they are going to let you put multiple producers on your EDR. They are also collaborative and considering allowing you to split the unit between multiple producers. So we will be only bringing the 1-liter size. 1 liter treats 250 40-kilogram animals or 425-kilogram animals. So if you have flocks that are not that large, the VDD is going to allow you to split units, which they don't usually allow. Veterinarians will have tracking responsibilities to report back to the authorities that it's working. And we are looking to provide a practical use guide. So the Veterinary Drugs Directorate has asked the industry, and I've spoken with Dr. Menzies and Dr. Peregrine already, that when the VDD grants your EDR, they will be sending you some guidance for appropriate use. We do not want this going into every animal in the flock. That is not going to make it a long-lived molecule. And Zolvix Plus will be ruined before it even gets here, if that's how it's used. The one online. just Google it. The one online. No, you do need a company contact to send that in. How is the easiest way for me to share that? If I send it to you, Paula, can you share it with the group?
We can send it to Servo.
We can send it to Servo. You'll send it to one of my regulators. Her name is Bina. I will give you her contact information. Her name has to go on the form.
And just out of curiosity, how long is it going to take before the drug gets here? I mean,
We are aiming for June. We will ship it by air. We are aiming for June. We were hoping to have it here for May, but we can't get it released by the through government approval in the UK until the middle of May. So June in hopes.
I just have another point which has nothing to do with the EDR, so I want to bring it up after you're done with talking about the EDR customer.
Yeah. Okay. And we have to thank Paula and Andrew for their hard work, because the VDD has been incredibly collaborative. They're very interested in supporting projects that support sheep and goats in particular right now. And so they have been very helpful in making this otherwise awkward process work relatively well. Yes.
so there's a special drench that comes with this leader. Is that coming with it, or how's it?
I will have to check. That's actually an excellent question, if it's going to come with each unit or not. I will confirm, and again, we'll share it with Servo.
Can you just specify this direction at this time? Yeah, just-
Oh, sorry, the question was, will the dosing gun come with the unit? We'll confirm that for you.
So once the initial 200 liters are used, what's the timeline on getting the next order in get required?
So we'll have 200 units available for 2023. And I estimated based on what the amount of StarTech that was used, we'd need 500 units next year for Canada. Hopefully we'll be able to provide that next year. So 200 units doesn't seem like a lot, but if we equate the amount of StarTech sold, 500 liters of Zolvix is equivalent to what was sold of StarTech last year. So we're meeting almost 50% of the need on very short notice, and we'll do better next year. Other questions that I can answer for you? Perfect.
I just had one point I wanted to make. If I need to go up, okay.
You don't need me for this point?
No, I don't, sorry, thanks. Thanks so much, Tamara. I just wanted to go back to what John Gilliard was saying about resistance, because Monopantal has shown, Zolvix has shown to develop resistance in other countries. And we don't have any money, but what, and I guess this is targeted both to producers and vets, is what we would love to get are some fecal samples from the farms that are going to be using Monopantal, and maybe we'll culture the larvae and preserve them so that we can try to monitor if resistance develops. There's a great opportunity here to see, to catch it in the early stages so that we can try to control it and not end up losing another drug. So that's the only point I wanted to make. John, did you want to say something more about that?
Really, just to re-emphasize that Canada's in a almost unique position here, right? You know, most countries have had these drugs kind of phased in over time and used in an uncontrolled fashion, and we've heard all about the problems. So in Canada, because these drugs have never been used before, it's highly unusual. And so I think, you know, if we can in a relatively small community, that if people use this responsibly, it will last way better. So again, in terms of using targeted selective approaches, probably not reaching for and certainly not reaching for Zolvix just because it's the new thing, without being sure it's what you need, and then thinking hard about the advice and guidelines which will come out. It's absolutely critical, and it isn't a theoretical thing. This, and Neil's got examples where resistance to Monopantal has happened. Zolvix has happened within a year or two of its use, literally. So if people start reaching for it and just using it, particularly on large groups of animals on its own, then it won't last very long. It really won't. So it's really critical.
Well, thank you for that. So, yeah, I'd just like to thank the 4 people who have stood up and spoken to you this evening. I hope it's been useful. I'd also like to thank all of you for coming along and listening and sharing some of your views and thoughts on all of this. I hope that you can continue to sort of engage with the topic through the likes of the Small Ruminant Veterinary Association here, or through your vets, or through you know, whoever it is that you're working with, and that this can be seen as a sort of across the industry type approach that we're going to develop to, or that you will be able to develop to sustainable worm control. So thank you very much to everyone for all your
I think that brings this evening to a close. We've gone a little bit over time. Thank you for your patience and for great discussion. And we hope you all have a safe drive home this evening.
I